In this video, we will study the servlet lifecycle in detail. So, how does a server invoke a servlet? Now, the server has the servlet file. So, let's say this is our server and it has a servlet. So, the server will load the servlet. So, there are two cases when the server can load the servlet. Either whenever it receives the first client request or whenever the server is starting. So depending on the configuration, if the server is configured to load all servlets on startup, then whenever this server will start, on start of the server, the servlet will be initialized. Otherwise, whenever the client sends the request for the first time, so whenever this server receives a request and then this request is for, let's say, servlet 1, at that time the server will load that servlet into memory. Next is the server creates one or more instances of the servlet class. So this servlet class, which is s1.java, so there will be instances of this class created. So the server will create objects of this class. Now, depending on the implementation, the server might create a single instance or it may create a pool of instances. So now let's say the server has created a pool of instances. So let's say we have created 4 instances. So all these instances are nothing but objects of this servlet class. So we have a servlet class called s1.java and these are just objects of s1. So the server has now created a pool of instances or it might be a single instance depending on if the implementation is a singleton implementation. Then the next step is that the server will construct a servlet config object and this object provides the initialization information to a servlet. So a servlet config object will be created. It contains the configuration information about our servlet. Now the server will call the servlet's init method and in this init method it will pass the configuration object as an argument to this init method. So this init method has one argument of type servlet config. So that will be passed for this to call this init method. Now, if we have multiple servlet instances, then init method will be called once for each instance. So this init method, so like here we saw, we have 4 instances. So the init method will be called 4 times. So once for each of these objects. The fifth step is that the server will construct a servlet request or HTTP servlet request. So if we are using a generic servlet, then it will create a servlet request. And if we are using HTTP servlet, then the server will construct an HTTP servlet request object. So depending on which type of servlet we are working with, generic or HTTP servlet, it will create either this object or the HTTP servlet request object. And how will it create this object? It will create this object using the data which has been received from the client. So the client had sent a request here and this request had some data, right? So using this data, the server will create an HTTP request object and it will contain this data. So this data D, which was passed from the client to the server, is now wrapped inside an object of type HTTP servlet request. Then the server will also create a servlet response or HTTP servlet response object depending on if it is a generic servlet or HTTP servlet. And this response object contains methods which can be used to manipulate the server's response. So because the server will now be creating a response which it needs to send back to the client, so that is why it will create an empty object. So this servlet response object will not contain anything right now. and we are going to build the response in the server, and then we are going to return this response back to the client. Now, the server will then call the service method. So the service method can either be do get or do post in case of our HTTP servlets. So because we will be working only with HTTP servlets, so just remember that it may be a call to do get or it may be a call to do post. Now, how will this be decided? This will be decided based on what the client has requested. So the client had sent a request, and if this request was a get request, then the do get method will be called. If this request was a post request, then the do post method will be called. And the arguments which are passed to this do get and do post method, they are the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response objects. So the objects that we created in step 5, these two objects will be passed to the do get or do post method. Now, if we have multiple requests which are coming concurrently, then multiple service methods can run in separate threads. So, what do we mean by multiple service methods can run in separate threads? It means that they will be running parallelly and they will be handled by the same object. So, we don't need multiple objects for that. Or if we have a pool of objects, if we have multiple objects like we had created it in the starting. So in that case, if there are multiple clients who are sending requests for the same servlet, then we may also allot them different objects who can handle their request, or we can also call the service method of the same object in multiple threads. The service method will then process the request and respond using the HTTP response or servlet response object. Now, if the server now again receives a new request for the same process, same servlet, then the process will begin again from step 5. So we will not go back to initializing the servlet again. We will not go back to step 1 wherein we were creating the objects and we were calling the init method. The process will begin from step 5. So whenever a client request comes, we will be creating a HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response method, and then the service method will be called and the request will be processed and the response will be sent. Once the response is sent back to the client from step 7, that request has been handled. So the complete cycle of the request coming from the client and the response going back to the client is from step 5 to step 7. And if again there is a new request, then again the same process will be repeated. The last step is unloading the servlet. So the servlet is unloaded by the servlet container if the server shuts down or if the server is reloading the whole web application again. So if we are stopping our web application and reloading it, so if we clean and build our application and deploy it again on the server, then in that case the server needs to be unloaded and then the server will be loaded again. So again the init method will be called.